Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you. I'm Linda Zerilli. I teach political theory at the University of Chicago, and I'm honored to be here. This is a wonderful setting and an absolutely marvelous conference at just the right time in our political history. So I want to thank Roger and the whole team of people who have worked to put this together. I have the pleasure of briefly introducing Martin Gurri, who worked for 29 years as an analyst and manager at the Director of National Intelligence Open Source Center. Martin is currently President Chief Analyst at Fifth Wave Analytics, and he led a team that designed a methodology for the analysis of visual persuasion in global politics. And I guess out of that came the book, Our Visual Persuasion Gap. His most recent book is The Revolt of the Public and the Crisis of Authority in the New Millennium, which examines the impact of the digital revolution on political authority. Please join me in welcoming Martin Gurri.
Thank you, Linda. Good afternoon. We're all awake? Yes? All right. I don't know whether it's appropriate for me to say that I'm happy to be here in a conference dedicated to plumbing the darkness of our times. Let me just say that I'm happy to stand before this particular audience and share my thoughts on this particular subject. That subject is the tectonic collision between a networked public and the old hierarchical institutions we have inherited from the industrial age. I really worked, all those fancy initials, but my real work was in the corner of CIA that studies global media. There, around the turn of the new millennium, my fellow analysts and I watched a tsunami of digital information swell and build and then crash over the land. Wow. I have special effects. Thank you, thank you. Crash over the landscape. All right. Leaving very little untouched. At first, we were mesmerized by the sheer volume of the thing, the sum of human information, which since the days of the cave paintings had grown in a stately incremental manner, was now roughly doubling every year. But it was the effects of the tsunami that mattered. Human relations were being transformed. Social and commercial relations, first of all, but in time and in consequence, power relations as well. We could see fierce old dictatorships losing control over their own stories. A surprising number of them collapsed. Democratic governments became terrified of the public, and with good reason. The wave of information resembled an acid bath of negation. Information, it turned out, has authority in proportion to its scarcity. The more there is, the less people believe. That is the background theme of my story today. So what do I mean by authority, and why is it in crisis? Before we get to the revolt of the public, let's reflect on its target, the old dispensation. For around 150 years, authority resided in the great institutions of the industrial world. Modern government, of course, but also the corporation, the labor union, the university, the media, the scientific establishment. The elites who mediated between these institutions and the public were the keepers of truth and certainty. How was this possible? Well, first of all, no alternatives existed. Each institution held a semi-monopoly over the information in its own domain. When Walter Cronkite, face and voice of a great institution, CBS News, told us that's the way it is, we had no way of falsifying him. Now, the human race has been organized hierarchically ever since we attained meaningful numbers. The industrial mind just made the pyramid bigger, steeper, and more efficient. Wave if you know Frederick Winslow Taylor. Oh, okay, all right. 3 people, I think. Taylor was one of the great prophets of industrialism. He preached scientific management, and that has always been the mantra of the industrial elites, that they are scientific. Their authority is derived from esoteric knowledge that the public lacks. In Taylor's system, that knowledge justified control over every step of the manufacturing process. His ideal worker was a sort of robot programmed from the top. Politics followed a parallel path. In the great mass movements and totalitarian dictatorships that arose after the First World War, the individual disappeared into the masses. Democratic governments became both more intrusive and more remote. Policymaking devolved to a class of experts with Taylorist pretensions and utopian ambitions. Politicians made and make, to this day, extraordinary claims of competence, that they can command the transactional swirl of the modern economy, for example, or somehow engender equality of social standing, or win a war against poverty or crime or drugs or cancer. Juscelino Kubitschek, not very remembered these days, democratically elected president of Brazil, promised to compress 50 years of progress in 5 by building Brasilia, that hyper-modern city of man. The reality is that democratic governments have been pounding away at the same projects for over a century. We know by now what they can do well and what they can't. They can build highway systems, they can eradicate contagious disease, but they can't fix whatever is broken in the human animal. They can't deliver utopia. Whenever they tried, they failed. So Brasilia failed to deliver 50 years of progress in 5. The wars against social conditions like poverty and crime ended with the enemy pretty much standing where he had been when hostilities began. Most of the grandiose projects of the 20th century failed on their own terms. But the story told about these efforts wasn't one of hubris and failure, but one of a soaring ambition to improve the human lot, of reaching for the stars. So long as the elites held the commanding heights of information and communication, they were the only authority in town. Once the tsunami fractured that monopoly, the elites as a class, their authority, and the institutions they managed all lapsed into crisis. The forces that swept away the old dispensation came almost entirely from below. They represented the voice of the gifted amateur, the articulate non-elites. In terms of institutional standing, the individuals responsible were often insignificant persons, people from nowhere. Sean Fanning was 18, an unknown kid, when he released the first version of Napster in June 1999. The shock of that beta release sent a mighty institution, the music industry, into a downward spiral that it has not really recovered from yet. Hossein Darakhshan, better known by his blog name Hodor, was an ordinary Iranian 20-something who, in September 2001, succeeded in adapting blogging software to the requirements of Farsi script. The consequences were remarkable. Tens of thousands of Farsi language blogs materialized in Iran. Many commented on political news, advocated feminism, criticized corruption of regime officials. Poor Hodor spent 6 years in prison for insulting the sanctities of the Islamic Republic. Wael Ghonim described himself as an ordinary Egyptian, and so he was in many ways. He created a Facebook page and, in the form of a Facebook event invitation, called for the protests that ultimately led to the fall of Hosni Mubarak's regime in Egypt. Over 1 million Facebook users viewed the invitation. Around 100,000 said they would attend. Ghonim was thrown in prison during the protest, but was released and was negotiated with by government ministers who clearly believed he was an important revolutionary leader. Symbolically, that was true. He embodied the tsunami. But empirically, he was a political nobody whose claim to fame was he administered a Facebook page. With Wael Ghonim and his kind, we come to the hero of my story, or maybe the anti-hero, depending on where you sit. What is the public? And why, if I may quote old Mel Brooks, is it revolting? First, let's specify what the public is not. It isn't the people, or the masses, or the crowd. It isn't a fixed body of any kind. It isn't even one. I should rightly say publics, but that sounds terrible, so I don't. The public was formed by the dissolution of the industrial masses and their migration away from the center toward vital communities that represented their true interests and obsessions all along. In many cases, the journey has led to distant islands of personal identity. Information has been the catalyst, the perturbing agent in this process. The tsunami is really the public asserting its opinions and its tastes. Digital platforms provide the public with its organizational form, the network. Nothing within the bounds of human nature could be less like hierarchy. Digital networks are egalitarian to the brink of dysfunction. Walter Lippmann, whose definition I used, tells us that the public is merely the persons interested in an affair. That affair can be trivial. Cute cats, Taylor Swift, Star Wars. But when the public engages in politics, it's to promote some specific cause, to right a specific wrong, to tag some specific person or event or policy with the correct modifiers. Online political communities were spawned by the traditional right and the traditional left, but are not interested in working out coherent ideologies. They care passionately and obsessively about their particular affair. Anti-globalists, for example, care about the tyranny of corporations. Anarchists, libertarians, care about the tyranny of government. Neither imagines that they are espousing a system of ideas that might be opposed by a different system of ideas. They think that they know truth, and that their opponents must therefore be liars, cheats. These groups are born in negation. You're going to hear me say that word a lot. Friction with the status quo brings them into being, and they exist to attack, condemn, repudiate. Negation binds a network together and transforms it into a political force. You stand against Mubarak, for example, or Obama, or capitalism. Once the oppositional impulse is spent, there's very little left. If you asked an indignado, read their documents, if you ask an indignado or an occupier or a Tea Partier what they stood against, you would get long, long lists of grievances. If you'd ask what they stood for, you get throat-clearing noises and generalities like social justice or the Constitution. Any form of organization, of command and control, is offensive to the egalitarian spirit of the web. Digital networks resemble barbarian war bands that roam the political landscape looking to win honor and fame in heroic combat with the enemy. The weird dynamics of the web makes verbal violence, ritual rage, the only acceptable rhetorical posture. Every political controversy ends in personal abuse and death threats. Extreme actors on opposite sides rejoice in finding each other. They can engage in loud and vicious combat, attract attention, drown out moderate voices. There's perverse satisfaction, almost happiness, when the people you oppose perpetrate some horror. It proves beyond reasonable doubt that they should not be allowed to exist. The public has bought into the exaggerated claims of competence of the politicians. This is very strange, very central to our predicament. Even as the public repudiates modern government, it imposes fantastic expectations on it. On the one hand, government is the instrument of self-serving elites. On the other, it must deliver not only social justice and freedom, but personal fulfillment and even identity. Political failure, which, given the expectations, is inevitable, evokes intensely personal feelings of injury and anger. Mind you, the carriers of this anger rarely belong to marginalized groups. They tend to be young, university educated, highly articulate, owners of digital devices, masters of the information sphere. Their rage, in fact, is informational. Facebook and YouTube and Twitter torment them with a world full of unbearable things. The web exists in a state of nature. Things are said and done there because they can be said and done. A great deal of hypocrisy is therefore baked into those political communities that are born online. The rage is mostly rhetorical. The death threats are mostly a grab for attention through outrageous behavior. But when negation and repudiation play the part of ideology, when rage stoked to the max is the default rhetorical posture, when attention is the highest value and is earned by the intensity with which you demonize opponents, then we shouldn't be surprised if individuals cross a hazy frontier between the virtual and the real, materialize among us, and begin to shed blood. The two nice-looking young men on the slide, between them, murdered 126 innocent strangers and wounded and maimed many more. They represent the nihilist, the public as destroyer of worlds. The question has been posed at this conference whether we are witnessing the rise of authoritarian or fascist governments. Among the old democracies, at least, I believe the opposite is closer to the truth. Democratic governments are terrified of the public's unhappiness. They know that heroic actions are expected of them, but also that every initiative will be savaged and every failure amplified. Their behavior is the opposite of authoritarian. It's a drift to dysfunction, to paralysis. Now, yes, there are Nazis among us. They are one byproduct of the public's escape to what I would call sectarian islands of identity. These people with their tiki torches, they look pretty amusing, but they are no joke. One of their number, all of 20 years of age, plowed his car into a crowd of counter-protesters, killing a woman and injuring many others. So far as is known, the perpetrator wasn't acting on orders from his Führer or from anyone else. He was acting on an impulse, the impulse to kill, to destroy. Given our structural realities, I am not too worried about the authoritarian or the fascist. I'm worried about that young man, about the nihilist who believes with passionate intensity that destruction and slaughter are by themselves a form of progress. And maybe we should all worry whether the nihilist impulse has gained a broad enough acceptance with the public to make itself felt in the highest reaches of power. Donald Trump has been good to me. He has sold a lot of copies of my book. Still, I suspect he's the reason we're here, talking about democracy in dark times. Hillary Clinton may be the very model of the entitled elite, but if she had won, few here, I'm guessing, would have had cause to raise apocalyptic political scenarios. So why? What's so terrifying about Trump? Well, he's Frankenstein's monster. He's Hitler. He's Mussolini, or maybe Augusto Pinochet. These things have been said. Allow me to take a somewhat more analytical approach. I see Trump as an episode in the revolt of the public. Only in that context, I believe, could such a strange figure rise so fast, so far. Trump is a peacock, among the dull buzzards of US politics, the one discernible theme of his life is the will to stand out, to attract all eyes in the room by being the loudest, most colorful, most aggressively intrusive person there. No question that he has succeeded. By every measure I have seen, Truck sucks up our attention to a staggering level. He is less Adolf Hitler and more P.T. Barnum. Only the circus is himself. This aligns him with a public that often confuses personal fantasies with practical politics. Trump has mastered the nihilist style of the web. That, to me, is the most significant factor separating him from the pack. His opponents speak in jargon and cliches. He speaks in rant. He attacks, insults, condemns, doubles down on misstatements, never takes a step back, never apologizes. Everyone he dislikes is a liar, a bimbo, bottom paid for, the equivalent of a child molester. Ian Baruma has written that this sort of abuse is what aspiring politicians have sought to do. But dictators don't deal in tweets. Trump is in the style of our moment, a man from nowhere, with no stake in the system, ignorant of history, incurious about our political habits and traditions, but happy to bash and to break old and precious things in exchange for a little attention. Rhetorical aggression defines the political web. By embracing Trump in significant numbers, the public has signaled that it is willing to impose the untrammeled relations of social media on the fragile forms of American democracy. I want to leave you with a question, what I call my cosmic Trump question. Imagine a world in which an insignificant person with a talent for self-promotion decides to enter an election because all the cameras are there. No thought of winning. And is catapulted to the presidency by historical forces over which he has no control and which he does not in the least understand. What follows? Well, if you think Trump is Hitler, you can relax. He's not. You can quit the resistance and go to the ballpark. Trump doesn't need your help to fail. But if you're me, tracking the trajectory of this structural conflict between political elites who are bleeding authority and a public that is stuck in negation, if you're me, you worry that in a few years we might look back on these dark times and think of Trump as the good old days. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Martin. I'm going to just sort of get us going in the way of questions, and then I'd like to open it up so people will have an opportunity to speak. There's a lot going on in your talk in terms of the relationship of technology to authority, to the public, to the demise, I guess, of the public realm in any kind of way in which we might want to see it. You didn't use the word populism, but it seemed like populism was sort of somehow embedded in this talk in a way. The reference, I want to focus first on this question of the public, because you referenced Walter Lippmann. And as you well know, having read Lippmann, I mean, Lippmann was not did not have a lot of faith in the public, right? I mean, he really thought that elites were important in a democracy. So what I'm trying to figure out in your talk is are you saying that the technological revolution, the media revolution, the internet revolution has in some ways really corrupted the democratic public, or do you have misgivings about the democratic public that are in some way separable from the question of this media revolution?
Well, first of all, with Lippmann, I mean, he was very much what you would call an elite's elite. And yes, he did think that the public, the book that I took the quote from is, or the definition from is called The Phantom Public. Mm-hmm. He kind of tried to work out a way in which the public became identical to the ideal citizen, and he couldn't come up with that, obviously. That probably never could have happened. So we shouldn't be surprised that he was not particularly fond of the public. The elites usually are not. I don't think the public has been corrupted. I think the public has been empowered. I think the problem is, for reasons that need to be analyzed very deeply, because there's an internal dynamic that goes on. When everything fractures and the only value is attention, then the amount of yelling and screaming that you can do is a measure of your value. And so when you have one gigantic pot and tiny number of people speaking on this platform, it's much easier to manage from the top than it is when everybody gets to say what they will. But I think the problem is not the public. And in some ways, the public has, I think, a fair charge to make on the elites. The elites, by the measure that they put themselves up, by their own standards, have failed and refuse to accept that. But the crisis is one of a collision between these two very different ways of thinking, in which the worst of both is coming forward. And no progress is being made. The public will never create a revolution. We were talking before about revolution here. That's not going to happen. The public is not interested in revolution. It's interested in being against this, against that, against the other, and specifically could be very effective doing that. But it's not interested in being in charge of power. The elites, on the other hand, have no interest in listening to the public, and have not learned the lesson that now that we're socially flattened, our lives are flattened by technology, which is what you brought up, suddenly to be raised up to some kind of 1950 pyramid when somebody speaks and we're supposed to say, oh yes, the fact that I know hundreds of bits of information that dispute what you're saying, I'm supposed to ignore because you are an authority, that's not going to work. So to me, the complication is more in the conflict between the two sides, and how that can be worked out, and that it not work out to be the worst of all possible outcomes, than the public being corrupted, or even the institutions being mismanaged.
But I mean, there is I think that most people in this room who probably do use social media would agree, and I'd like to get some questions on this in just a moment, that social media is a very complex and ambivalent, let's say ambiguous tool for democratic change, right, and democratic governance. I mean, you had one line in your talk where you said, I think rightly, that the more information that we have, the less credible information is. And if you actually, if you look at, the list of, I think Gallup poll, just the most recent Gallup poll on Americans' confidence in their institutions, with Congress being at the very bottom, was just above that was internet news. And yet internet news does seem to drive so much of politics in this country. So how do we put together those? It's a paradox of sorts, right? Because if people really don't think it's credible, then how is it that this news is in fact driving the political scenarios that...
Well, I honestly, I don't know what is driving anything anymore. I see everything, and I'll be the first to admit that I haven't researched it deeply. But what has happened, I think, is that the public was essentially artificially labeled the masses. And that was very convenient if you were a politician or if you were selling things. You could sell to the masses. You could produce for the masses. You didn't have to actually take their tastes into account. That technology, the technological change, has changed that. we have now a very personalized technology and a very expressive technology. So the public wants its personal tastes, and it's expressing them pretty vociferously. And so they're migrating for what they would have been all along. There is no mass. We have always lived in small communities. The problem is we used to be geographically dispersed. Now we're all on Facebook or whatever. And so it becomes a jostling of communities that are trying to garner attention. And the successful movements, and I think Barack Obama was like that, and I think Donald Trump is like that as well, are the ones that are so anti. They can generate such a sense of let's go against the status quo that everybody ignores the fact that they really don't agree very much about what's to be done once you defeat the status quo. But you can rally behind that person or that force and bash away at things as they are. Is it pathological? I think in a way it is. Is it also in some ways more realistically reflective of the public? I don't think there's any question that it is. We are not a mass. We're all very different, and we live in very different communities. The question is how can we online make these very different, very obsessive too for some reason. There's something about online communities that tend to be very obsessive. It's their thing and nothing else. Well, the talk of intersectionality I'm watching with interest, but I don't believe in it until I see it, is everybody's interested in their thing. How do you make all these groups, all these communities, which are real, they're very organically self-selected, deal with democracy in a way that's not anti, that's not destructive, that's not nihilistic in the end?
Questions? Yes?
I'm not sure if it's just me who didn't understand this or whether something needs clarification. Are you saying, I'm trying to understand what you're saying is the cause of the nihilism. Is it because of this tsunami of information, or is the tsunami of information and social media explosion or internet data explosion a consequence of people's mistrust, or is it cause and effect that's circular?
I think yes and yes. The tsunami of information essentially delegitimized all the standing institutions who had made certain claims that were now being shown to be at least partially false. I mean, the claims exceeded their actual capacity. I think the dynamics of what has evolved, and I'm not a believer in determinism, so it could have worked out differently, but what has worked out is you make a name for yourself online politically, attract attention, which is really the highest value, by negation, by condemnation, by striking an anti-pose. And I think if you push that logically enough, you have those kinds of actors competing with one another, you reach a point where everything is bad. You attack a person and you attack a moment, an election, but at a certain moment the entire system becomes implicated and you're against the entire system. And if you have nothing you want to put in their place, and I have none of the groups that I studied had any idea. Many of them, like the Indignados and the Tent City people in Israel, were asked both by their governments and by the media, so what is it that you want? And it was like, what? You know, there were like tens of thousands of answers. It's not that they didn't have answers, but there was no single answer. It was not an organized movement around what they wanted done. They just were very clear what they were against. So you push that far enough where there's nothing that is you're advocating, but you're very ferocious in your negations, you reach a tipping point. You reach a tipping point where you're basically a political vandal.
Sir?
You're talking about the excess of information. Now, information basically are communication channels, and when we're talking about attention, there's so many signals. William James said they're just booming confusion of signals, and by attention we exert a choice, And I just recently read an article, I think in Atlantic or someplace, where they say that the post-millennial generation now, the new kids growing up, and maybe I can hear from one of them, that they get their information, their communication channel, the main one, is the iPhone. And you look around the audience right now, I just looked around and see how many people are on their iPhones as I'm speaking right now. And they say that this is a qualitative change in the way that we communicate. And I think that that has a lot to do with what you were just talking about. That is, in order to get people to enter into a political discussion, you first have to get their attention.
Yeah, youthful looking though I am, I would never presume to say how it is that young people get their information. I have 3 millennial kids, and what I get from them when I start talking is, "Oh, Dad, you know, that's so yesterday." You know. So I have no idea. I do think I avoid talking about new media or social media, and I prefer talking about information and the information sphere, because what has happened is not, obviously new media was the driver, but what we have ended up with is a very gigantically redundant information sphere, which governments and authorities cannot shut out unless you want to go the North Korean route. That was the only way. You know, if you're willing to put up with famine and prison camps, then you bet that side of the dictatorship, and you're probably not going to get a revolt to the public. Anything less than that, you're in trouble. And I mean, Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, who had Wael Ghonim chewing on his butt, switched off the internet and turned off, actually, mobile phone service. And it made absolutely no difference. There was a churning of information. There was still television. There were many different ways in which people could both get information in Egypt and information out of Egypt through cell phones being emailed and so forth, could be gotten out. It made no difference. It made no difference. So I would think less in terms of new media and in terms of this gigantically churning information sphere that is driven, again, politically by very passionate negation.
Yes, sir.
You identified, I guess, the phenomenon, the environment, the nihilism and the decline of the authority of the elites, and they combine together to produce, essentially making the real world turn into a giant flame war. And that brings us Donald Trump, who you say is essentially a carnival barker and pretty much can be ignored since he's surrounded by, father figures and so on who are keeping him in charge. But it occurs to me that after him, then what? His technique is not something that's special only to him. Somebody with inimical import could adopt his same techniques and apply them in the same existing environment, and then we have a problem. How would you address that?
Yeah, I'm not sure I get that question. Could you repeat that or rephrase it a little bit?
Well, you say Trump is not Hitler, but there could be a competent Trump, and then who would, seize upon this disaffection and nihilism and so on to actually produce much greater damage than mere neglect.
Well, my Trump question is a question. He may be a world historical figure in the end, and he may be the nihilist who bashed our system into non-existence. I don't know. My bet is not. My bet is not. And of course, he's the president, so he's making decisions that are consequential one way or the other. My point is, in the actual environment as we have it now, it is very difficult for somebody to set himself up as, somebody said that he was charismatic. I heard that said. I mean, I don't know how that can be, for example, jive with the data. I mean, even the people who voted for him didn't like him in large numbers. I mean, so he clearly, what does that tell you? He clearly was an instrument for some people who didn't particularly like him to get a point across. And the point was probably very negative, but he is sometimes portrayed as manipulating those people. Maybe that's true. My take is maybe it was the other way around.
I would actually like to ask another question, which is because, I mean, sometimes it sounds like you're saying that, you know, there's a sort of information overload now, right? I mean, the tsunami of information as you describe it. And, you know, you could argue it, but at the same time, you would not want to then impose restrictions on information because that would be anti. Yeah. Okay, right. So, but, you know, there's another way of looking at it, which is, it isn't that we're just sort of swimming in all this information. It's that the, quote, information that comes our way every day is, first of all, highly processed, even though it is invisibly so. So, you know, Google, for example, search pages and all the rest. I mean, that's an invisible mechanism that is actually controlling the way in which we count. What's going to count as information is something that we're quite unaware of because of the actual technology. And secondly, that a lot of people, it's not that they're swimming in information, it's that the information that they get is always the same thing every day, more or less. It's like a repetition rather than a plurality or something of information. And so you know, those are two different kinds of problems, I think.
Yeah, I guess the model you were kind of drawing is not the way I see it. We are not like we used to be, sitting like this and the information is coming at us. That is one mode in which we live. But this information doesn't just arise. We are the information, right? We are, I mean, I'm a part of the public, as everybody here. We are creating this tsunami ourselves. That's something you can disassociate with yourselves from. So, with regards to authority, I mean, I could give you an example from CIA. CIA, the president used to get a briefing from CIA. CIA said, this is so. And the president said, cool, okay? And CIA was wrong. Every time yesterday and tomorrow were different, CIA was wrong, right? CIA predicted yesterday, every day it was history. And mostly you get it right, because mostly tomorrow always looks like yesterday. But every once in a while, something terrible would happen, and CIA would get it wrong. No, didn't matter. No other game in town. Then suddenly, presidents were being shown this and that and the other from the internet, and it's like, look, somebody posted something over here, and suddenly the president was beginning to push back. And I mean, by the time I left, honestly, it was the Obama era. I don't think he paid a hoot of attention to CIA, and he was probably right not to particularly. The value of the CIA's information, which is, the CIA was kind of like Walter Cronkite, you know, it's like, that's the way it is, had been diluted by these other actors producing information, which was being read by people in authority. And so what was important, and what was a true source? When, yes, and I agree with you, the Google algorithms are a powerful attention-getting device, and there are royal battles to get ahead of those, right? To be the ones that come up first in a search. But in the end, when you think about it, it's when there are 10 stories for every possible scenario, and everybody's claiming that, well, why would you pick one rather than the other? And then you know there are like probably a semi-infinite number out there that you haven't even thought about or come across that are below the algorithmic line. Authority just becomes very shaky. It seems arbitrary. It begins to seem like you're cherry-picking your problems and your answers. And I think that's what's happening now. So it's not we're swimming in it, we're producing it, and we're fighting in it.
Other questions? Yes? No, actually, this gentleman right here. I'll get to you next.
How do you think we're doing now with our 7 plagues? I'm being a bit too clever, but there's a lot of bad shit happening, right? The hurricanes, all of those things, the fires and all. Okay, now this is all, how is the internet dealing with this? Because psychically, many of us feel like we're in a nightmare, we can't wake up. Is it good, bad? Do you have any feelings about it?
Yeah, honestly, I'm an analyst, and I like to think that that I don't go too far out beyond where my research is, and I haven't researched that particular aspect of how the internet dealt with the hurricanes.
But you said the internet is us.
It is us.
So how are we doing?
I haven't researched that either. Can I cop out of that one? I mean, it all depends. It all depends. It's a magnificent communications device, and many people, many things in life are made so much easier, including probably finding out where to go if you're evacuating from a hurricane, thanks to the internet. But as you say, the main feeling you have is of somebody screaming in your ear 24/7 that horrible things are happening. So, I don't know. That's not an analytical statement. That's just an impression.
Okay.
Fair enough.
Yes.
How is the algorithm of Google any different than the 40s and 50s from newspaper editors who had absolute control over what was going to appear?
Oh, the difference is Google is far more inclusive.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, because if you ever study agenda-setting theory about the news, I want to be in a some kind of group talking about media tomorrow, I guess. So I don't want to shoot my wad on that one. But basically, if you look at agenda-setting theory, fake news can mean a lot of things. And what agenda-setting theory tells you, the main thing it can tell you is what is not being covered. And in the 40s and 50s, there was a decision. There's always these institutions had interests, and the people they served at the top in particular, they had interests. And it may be that way down here there were a lot of people without those interests who were being ignored. So I think Google is a lot more inclusive than what you would have found back then.
Where does the idea of individuals exercising critical thinking come into this? Do we do it less? Do we do it more? Doesn't it matter?
Yeah, that's also beyond my bailiwick. I think the truly heartrending part of this is you can go to the web and find brilliant exercises in critical thinking. I am dependent on such for my labors. But of course, you also find much that is not. And the culture of the web is not critical. The culture of the web is attention-getting. This kind of egalitarian attention-getting where everybody's hopping up and down and saying, I am the one with the most horrible story to tell you today. And people pay attention to that somehow.
Yes.
I know you're talking about this idea of almost saturation to a certain extent of all this stuff that's going on in the world, to a greater extent than we've ever seen before. Do you believe that oversaturation is leading to a sense of ambivalence politically and socially, where people see things happening day after day? You wake up to a notification about another shooting and you don't care. Do you think that's because of the oversaturation or a separate social political entity?
That's a really good question. That actually is a very deep and very good question, and I don't have an answer. Honestly, I wish I did, but I don't.
Back there and then.
First of all, thanks for your talk. It's unfortunately persuasive, for me at least, and frightening. To the earlier point, I appreciate you not comparing Trump to Hitler, but the interesting thing that is comparative, and to the earlier questioner who is a little bit in front of me, the fear of the next one coming, taking advantage of the open door. If you look at the Weimar period, you'd had governments changing every 8 months or so. The lack of authority actually became the desire for authority. Whether it was Hitler or not, at least something would stay permanent and there could be some guidance. What you're describing suggests an understandable lean towards nihilism, because as oppressive as authority can be, the total absence of authority, or the multiplicity of authority where none is clearly the authority, is oppressive too, in a way. Freedom isn't that great. Freedom with absolutely no values or no sense of something being true can frighten people beyond compare, and whether that makes a whole people or a public or a mass, I don't know, but I think there is often a yearning for something that will give us guidance, and that does open a massive door to someone who's not a peacock, but someone with an ideology that seeks to have an answer that they have in their mind, and the people are ready for any answer right now in the absence of one. I don't know if you have an answer for that, but at least that's where you're leading me.
Well, thanks for the kind words. Let me now try and lead you in a slightly different direction.
Please.
I actually think, if you want to speak about the more positive side of the web in terms of the nightmare scenario you're posing, you would have to fly in the teeth of the culture that I have been describing to be able to get away with anything remotely like an authoritarian movement. This is so egalitarian, truly, that basically they would rather fail. If you look at the occupiers, to me, I love reading occupier documents. They basically talk and talk and talk. Anybody who come in and talk and say anything, and that was unprincipled. Nobody wanted to say, okay, enough, let's stick a vote. Votes were taboo. Nope, we just talk and talk until we reach some sort of consensus, or we keep talking. That kind of egalitarianism is both anti-ideology in a weird way. So you would, if the second you raise up an ideology for people to gather around, the first thing that people see from this culture is you're trying to dupe me with something, with a story. Secondly, anti-programs, anti-programmatics. So if you say, well, this is what I intend to do, you immediately lose half your audience because they say, well, that's not what I want to do, all right? And thirdly, anti-leader. The Führer principle, the leadership principle would be a hard thing to establish because that culture, the first thing you say in those groups is, well, I'm just an ordinary person. As Wael Ghonim says, I'm just an ordinary Egyptian, this man who's done extraordinary things. That's very much the way that you get recognized as somebody worth listening to, as saying, I'm just nobody. So that's why I'm talking here. I'm not your leader. So I think I fear the nihilist because precisely if you become mired in negation and you repudiate the status quo as it is, and you feel that its destruction without any other program or leader or whatever to put in its place would still be progress, then horrible things can happen without necessarily anybody taking over the government in an authoritarian form. Horrible things could happen, and have happened.
Okay, I think one more question. Did you have a question? I'm sorry, the woman there in red? No? Okay, yeah. Did you have a question? Okay.
But I guess I'm getting the impression that you're almost saying that the negativity that we're all feeling so strongly is actually probably not really true. Maybe things are not really any much worse than they've ever been. To some degree. To some degree.
If you have ever looked at the year 1937, things are not as bad now as they have ever been. That's a pretty safe empirical statement. Now, how bad are they? I don't know. My point is simply that there is you can say almost a cultural flow in these groups, which is based on the culture of the web, which is based on a struggle for attention, to base practically every statement made out in the public sphere on negation, on down with, I repudiate, I reject. And it may well be that the specifics of the case are worthy of rejection and repudiation. The problem is, at some point, the entire system becomes implicated in that gigantic host of negations. And then you go, well, what's left? What would you put in place?
Are we... Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.